What if the greatest mystical revolution in human history happened not in a temple or monastery, but in the mind of a wandering prophet whose teachings would secretly shape three world religions? Picture this. Somewhere in the wind-swept plateaus of ancient Persia, around the 7th century BCE, a visionary named Zarathustra received revelations that would fracture reality itself into light and darkness, truth and deception, choice and destiny. But here's the mystery that has haunted scholars for over 2 millennia. What happened to those teachings after the Gathas fell silent? The official story tells us that Zoroastrianism became the state religion of mighty Persian empires, only to fade into obscurity after the Islamic conquest of 651 CE. But beneath this surface narrative lies a hidden river of wisdom that never stopped flowing. Through secret texts compiled by Sasanian priests, through the mystical philosophy of medieval Islamic illuminationists, through the careful preservation of an oral tradition that predates written history, the esoteric heart of Zoroastrian wisdom has survived conquest, persecution, and near erasure. Today, we're going to uncover this hidden light of Persia, the mystical teachings, angelic cosmologies, and spiritual technologies that emerged after Zarathustra's death, transformed Persian consciousness, and continue to illuminate the path of inner transformation for seekers across the world. This is the story of how the prophet's fire never died, but learned to burn in secret. The Bunda Hishan, Denkard, and other Pahlavi texts compiled between the 3rd and 9th centuries CE represent far more than historical documents. They are the crystallization of centuries of oral mystical tradition that claim direct descent from Zarathustra himself. The death of Zarathustra, which tradition places in the 6th century BCE, though scholars debate the exact date, marked not the end of prophetic revelation, but the beginning of its transformation into something deeper and more complex. For nearly 1,000 years, his teachings lived primarily in memory, chanted by priest poets who understood that the most sacred knowledge could never be fully captured in written words. When the Sasanian Magi finally began committing these teachings to parchment in the 3rd century CE, they were not simply recording history, they were preserving a living cosmology that had grown far beyond anything the original prophet might have imagined. But what had changed? What new elements emerged in these post-Zarathustrian texts that were absent from the original Gathas? The answer reveals the first great paradox of esoteric Zoroastrianism. The religion became more dualistic in order to become more mystical. Where Zarathustra had spoken primarily of Ahura Mazda as the one uncreated God, the later texts introduced a complex angelology that would influence every subsequent mystical tradition in the West. The Amesha Spentas, the bountiful immortals, evolved from abstract divine qualities into personified archangels governing different aspects of creation. Vohu Mana became the angel of good thought, guiding the awakening consciousness. Asha transformed into the archangel of truth, whose fire burns away all deception. Spenta Armaiti became the divine feminine principle of devotion and the fertile earth. Are we witnessing theological evolution, or the recovery of teachings that Zarathustra himself had transmitted only to his closest disciples? The Denkard, that vast 9th century encyclopedia of Zoroastrian wisdom, claims that these later elaborations represent the restoration of knowledge that had been lost when, according to Zoroastrian sources, Alexander's armies burned the royal library at Persepolis. According to this traditional account, 21 volumes of the Avesta were destroyed, containing detailed instructions for spiritual practice that had to be painstakingly reconstructed from the memories of scattered priests. The emergence of what scholars call classical Zoroastrianism introduces us to concepts that would haunt Western esotericism for millennia. The Chinvat Bridge, that span across the abyss between life and death, which becomes wide as 9 spears for the righteous but razor-thin for the wicked, transforms from a geographical feature of the afterlife into a symbol of the consciousness that must be cultivated in this life. When the soul approaches the bridge after death, it encounters its own Dina, its accumulated ethical essence, taking the form of a beautiful maiden for the righteous or a hideous hag for the wicked. The bridge itself becomes wide as 9 spears for those aligned with truth, but razor-thin for the deceived. But esoteric interpretation reveals this as describing the daily experience of confronting the consequences of our choices, the internal judgment that operates every moment we choose between truth and deception. This mythic crossing foreshadows the final renovation of creation, the Frashokareti, when all souls will cross this bridge in the ultimate triumph of cosmic order. How did these mystical elaborations survive the turbulent centuries of conquest and cultural upheaval? The Bundahishan speaks of Fravashis, the eternal spiritual doubles of all beings, who exist simultaneously in the celestial realm and are incarnated in physical form. Every human soul possesses a Fravashi, a divine guardian presence that represents our highest potential and constantly draws us toward our ultimate destiny. This concept would later echo through various wisdom traditions under different names. But perhaps the most mysterious development in post-Zarathustrian Zoroastrianism was the emergence of Zurvanism, the doctrine of infinite time, as the primordial principle from which both Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu emerge. Zurvanism became a powerful current within Sasanian religion, though it was condemned as heretical by many Orthodox Zoroastrians, who saw it as undermining the strict dualism between good and evil that they considered essential to the faith. Was this a corruption of Zarathustra's monotheism, as many modern scholars claim? Or does it represent the surfacing of an even more ancient wisdom tradition that the prophet had integrated into his teachings? The Zurvanite texts speak of a time before time when the ultimate reality existed in perfect unity, neither light nor dark, neither good nor evil, but containing the potential for both. The rituals prescribed in these later texts reveal a sophisticated understanding of consciousness that anticipates many discoveries of modern neuroscience. The elaborate fire ceremonies with their precise timing according to stellar configurations, their use of specific fragrances and synchronized breathing and chanting, appear designed to induce altered states of consciousness that increase sensitivity to subtle environmental influences. The Vendidad's detailed purification practices, often dismissed by modern readers as primitive hygiene, actually constitute a comprehensive system for managing attention and energy, that parallels the most sophisticated contemplative traditions of Tibet and India. What becomes clear as we examine these post-Zarathustrian developments is that we are not witnessing the corruption of a pure monotheistic message, but rather its flowering into a complete mystical technology. The question that haunts every serious student of this tradition is whether these elaborations represent authentic transmissions from the prophet himself, or the creative interpretations of later generations seeking to keep his wisdom relevant to their own spiritual needs. As we'll see, this question becomes crucial when we encounter the medieval Islamic philosophers who would claim to be restoring this ancient Persian wisdom to its rightful place in the cosmos of knowledge. When the Sasanian Magi spoke of Yazatas, the beings worthy of worship, they were not indulging in polytheistic fantasy, but mapping the structure of consciousness as it opens to increasingly subtle dimensions of divine manifestation. The development of Zoroastrian angelology represents one of history's most sophisticated attempts to understand the relationship between transcendent reality and human experience. Unlike the angels of later monotheistic traditions, who often appear as mere messengers or soldiers in cosmic warfare, the Yazatas function as living principles of divine wisdom that can be directly contacted and worked with through spiritual practice. But how exactly does this angelic hierarchy operate? And what practical wisdom does it offer for contemporary seekers of transformation? The answer lies in understanding that each Yazata represents not merely a separate being, but a specific mode of divine manifestation that corresponds to both cosmic forces and psychological states within human consciousness. Take Mithra, perhaps the most complex of the Yazatas, who governs contracts, oaths, and the light that emerges at dawn. In the outer world, Mithra ensures that agreements are honored and that social order reflects cosmic order. In the inner world, Mithra represents the faculty of discrimination that allows consciousness to distinguish between truth and falsehood, reality and illusion. The elaborate Mithraic mysteries that would later captivate Roman legions were designed to awaken this discriminating wisdom through direct spiritual experience. Are we looking at psychology projected onto cosmology, or cosmology that reveals the true structure of psychology? The Persian mystics would have rejected this distinction entirely, insisting that the angelic realms and the depths of consciousness are the same reality approached from different angles. When the Bundahishan describes Srasha, the angel of divine obedience who guards the faithful during the dangerous hours between midnight and dawn, it simultaneously describes an objective spiritual force and a subjective state of surrendered attention that protects the seeker from the dissolution of ego boundaries. The genius of Persian angelology lies in its recognition that spiritual development requires relationship, not just with abstract principles, but with living intelligences that can guide, challenge, and transform human consciousness. The practice of invoking specific yazatas for specific purposes developed into a comprehensive curriculum for spiritual growth. Invoking Anahita, the goddess of sacred waters, develops the capacity for emotional purification and healing. Working with Varathragna, the angel of victory, cultivates the spiritual warrior's ability to overcome internal obstacles. Establishing relationship with Tishtraya, the star angel who brings rain, awakens the wisdom that knows how to create the conditions for new growth in both inner and outer life. Deep in the heart of Sasanian Persia, a mystical doctrine emerged that would challenge every conventional understanding of divine nature. Zurvanism, the teaching that time itself is the ultimate reality from which both good and evil, light and darkness, creation and destruction eternally emerge. To modern minds, accustomed to linear thinking, the Zurvanite cosmology appears almost incomprehensible. How can time be a deity? How can good and evil originate from the same source? How can the ultimate reality be simultaneously personal and impersonal, active and passive, creative and destructive? Yet for centuries, this doctrine dominated the religious imagination of the Persian Empire, influencing everyone from emperors to mystics, and leaving traces that can still be detected in the deepest levels of Islamic, Christian, and even modern psychological thought. But what exactly did the Zurvanite sages mean when they spoke of Zurvan Akarana, infinite time, as the father of both Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu? The surviving texts suggest they had discovered something that would not be articulated again until the emergence of depth psychology in the 20th century. The recognition that consciousness itself contains the potential for both integration and disintegration, creativity and destruction, love and fear. The central Zurvanite myth tells us that in the beginning, Zurvan existed alone in perfect unity, neither male nor female, neither light nor dark. For 1,000 years, Zurvan desired offspring, performing sacrifices to bring forth creation. But doubt crept into the divine mind. What if these sacrifices are in vain? This moment of doubt became the seed from which Angra Mainyu would emerge. The original desire for creation gave birth to Ahura Mazda. Are we witnessing here the first recorded recognition of what Jung would later call the shadow, the inevitable dark twin that emerges from every creative impulse? The Zurvanite understanding suggests that evil is not the opposite of good, but rather its necessary companion in the dance of manifestation. The implications of this teaching extend far beyond theology into the practical realm of spiritual development. If both light and darkness emerge from the same source, then the goal of spiritual practice cannot be the simple elimination of darkness, but rather the achievement of that higher perspective from which both light and dark serve the purposes of awakening. This understanding transforms the entire approach to working with difficult emotions, psychological complexes, and what contemporary psychology calls the shadow material. Traditional Zoroastrianism had taught that Angra Mainyu would ultimately be defeated and destroyed at the final renovation of creation. But Zurvanism introduced a more subtle understanding. Angra Mainyu serves Zurvan's purposes by providing the resistance necessary for consciousness to develop strength, discrimination, and compassion. Without the challenge of evil, good would remain merely potential. Without darkness to overcome, light would never discover its own luminous nature. How did this radical doctrine survive within a religious culture officially committed to the ultimate triumph of good over evil? The answer reveals one of the most sophisticated strategies for preserving esoteric wisdom ever developed. The Zurvanite teachings were embedded within the conventional Zoroastrian mythology as deeper layers of meaning accessible only to those who had developed the spiritual maturity to understand them. For the ordinary believer, the cosmic drama remained a straightforward conflict between Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, with human beings called to choose the side of light. But for the initiated mystic, this same drama described the eternal dance of complementary principles within consciousness itself. The goal was not to eliminate one principle in favor of the other, but to achieve that transcendent perspective from which both principles could be seen as servants of a wisdom too profound for conceptual understanding. The practical implications of Zurvanite mysticism appear most clearly in its understanding of ethical action. Rather than following rigid moral codes, the Zurvanite practitioner learns to respond spontaneously to each situation from the perspective of infinite time itself. This might require what appears to be good action in one moment, and what seems like evil action in another. But both responses serve the deeper purpose of awakening consciousness to its own true nature. This teaching would later influence the development of antinomian currents within Islamic mysticism, Christian Gnosticism, and Jewish Kabbalah, traditions that recognize the necessity of transcending conventional morality in order to achieve authentic spiritual realization. But it also created dangers that led to the official suppression of Zurvanism by later Sasanian monarchs who feared its potential for undermining social order. What happened to Zurvanite wisdom after the Islamic conquest? Rather than disappearing, it went underground, emerging in disguised forms throughout the subsequent history of Persian mysticism. When Suhrawardi speaks of the ancient Persian sages who understood the unity underlying all apparent oppositions, he is almost certainly referring to Zurvanite teachings. When Ibn Arabi describes the perfect human being who has transcended the duality of good and evil, he echoes insights that first appeared in Zurvanite texts. When modern depth psychologists speak of integrating the shadow, they are rediscovering principles that Persian mystics had been practicing for over a millennium. The ultimate mystery of Zurvanism lies in its claim that time itself possesses consciousness, that the very fabric of temporal existence is aware, intelligent, and purposeful. This insight anticipates developments in contemporary physics and consciousness studies that suggest the universe itself might be a vast information processing system capable of learning, evolution, and self-transcendence. But how does understanding Zurvan as conscious time change our approach to meditation, ethical action, and spiritual development? As we'll discover, this question would haunt Islamic mysticism for centuries, ultimately producing some of the most profound spiritual teachings ever recorded. The Chinvat Bridge, that razor-thin span between life and death, time and eternity, judgment and mercy, represents far more than Zoroastrian mythology about the afterlife. It describes the precise mechanism by which consciousness transforms itself through the encounter with its own accumulated choices. In the deepest teachings of Persian mysticism, The journey across the Chinvat Bridge becomes a metaphor for every moment of spiritual awakening. When the Bundahishan describes the soul's encounter with its own Dana, the ethical essence that manifests as either a beautiful maiden or a terrifying hag, it is simultaneously describing what happens after death and what happens every time consciousness becomes fully present to the consequences of its own actions. But what exactly is this bridge? And how did later mystics learn to use its symbolism as a practical technology for transformation? The esoteric interpretation suggests that the Chinvat Bridge represents the faculty of spiritual discrimination that must be developed through systematic practice. Just as the deceased soul must face its accumulated karma in the form of the Dana, the living practitioner must learn to see through the illusions and rationalizations that prevent clear ethical vision. The technology of crossing the bridge while still alive involves 3 distinct phases, each corresponding to a different level of spiritual maturation. In the first phase, the seeker learns to recognize the voice of Asha, cosmic truth, amid the conflicting voices of desire, fear, social conditioning, and spiritual ambition. This requires developing what the texts call the eye of Vohumana, the capacity to see situations from the perspective of divine wisdom rather than personal preference. Are we dealing here with meditation techniques, psychological practices, or something else entirely? The surviving descriptions suggest a synthesis of all 3, combined with elements that don't fit neatly into any modern category. The practice of standing before Rashnu, the divine judge who weighs souls on the Chinvat Bridge, involves a daily examination of conscience that goes far beyond conventional moral reflection. The practitioner learns to review each day's actions, words, and thoughts, not from the perspective of social approval or personal satisfaction, but from the imagined viewpoint of someone who sees all consequences rippling forward through time. This practice develops what contemporary psychology might call systems thinking, the ability to perceive the long-term and far-reaching effects of apparently minor choices. The second phase involves learning to die consciously while still alive. The Persian mystics understood that biological death represents only the culmination of a process that can be initiated voluntarily through spiritual practice. By learning to release identification with thoughts, emotions, social roles, and even the physical body, the practitioner gains direct experience of the consciousness that survives the dissolution of these temporary formations. This practice of conscious dying appears in various forms throughout later mystical traditions. The Sufi practice of fanna, extinction in the divine, directly parallels the Zoroastrian teaching about dissolving the false self in order to discover the immortal essence. The Christian mystic's dark night of the soul describes the same process of ego dissolution that the Persian texts call crossing the bridge of sighs. Even modern psychotherapy recognizes that psychological healing often requires a willingness to let go of familiar but limiting identity structures. But the third phase of bridge crossing involves something that most later traditions either ignored or misunderstood: the conscious choice to return to ordinary life while maintaining the expanded perspective gained through the death-rebirth process. The Persian texts speak of those who have crossed the Chinvat bridge and chosen to return as living Fravashis, embodied spiritual beings who serve as bridges between the human and divine realms. This teaching addresses one of the most persistent problems in spiritual development: the tendency for mystical experience to create a split between sacred and ordinary consciousness. The Persian tradition insists that authentic spiritual realization must be able to function effectively in the world of daily life, relationships, and practical responsibilities. The test of genuine bridge crossing is not the ability to achieve extraordinary states of consciousness, but the capacity to bring divine perspective into the most mundane activities. How did this understanding of the Chinvat bridge influence the development of Islamic mysticism? When we examine the writings of Persian Sufi masters like Najm al-Din Kubra, Suhrawardi, and later figures like Mulla Sadra, we find repeated references to experiences that closely parallel the traditional descriptions of bridge crossing. The Sufi practice of muraqaba, spiritual death and rebirth under the guidance of a master, appears to be a direct adaptation of Persian bridge crossing techniques. The practical methods for bridge crossing preserved in the esoteric texts reveal a profound understanding of the relationship between consciousness and what contemporary neuroscience calls neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new neural pathways throughout life. The elaborate visualization practices, with their emphasis on imagining specific landscapes, encounters with angelic beings, and journeys through different levels of reality, appear designed to create new patterns of neural activation that support expanded awareness. What modern practitioners often miss is that the Persian tradition never viewed bridge crossing as a purely individual achievement. The consciousness that successfully crosses the bridge becomes capable of serving as a bridge for others, a living demonstration that the journey from ordinary awareness to divine realization is actually possible. This understanding would prove crucial when Islamic mystics began developing the institution of the spiritual guide, or peer, whose function is to embody the possibility of transformation for seekers who have not yet achieved it themselves. The deepest mystery of the Chinvat bridge lies in its revelation that judgment and mercy are not opposite forces, but complementary aspects of a single divine activity. The soul that encounters its Dina in the form of a beautiful maiden experiences the mercy that flows from alignment with cosmic truth. The soul that faces its Dana as a terrifying hag experiences the judgment that results from persistent self-deception. But both experiences serve the same ultimate purpose: the awakening of consciousness to its own true nature. As we'll see, this understanding of divine judgment as divine mercy would become central to the Islamic mysticism that preserved and transmitted Persian wisdom through the centuries of political upheaval. In 12th century Aleppo, a young Persian philosopher named Shahab al-Din Suhrawardi was about to undertake the most audacious intellectual project of the medieval world: the complete reconstruction of ancient Persian wisdom within the framework of Islamic philosophy. Suhrawardi lived only 36 years, but in that brief span he managed to create a synthesis so profound that it would influence Islamic mysticism, Renaissance magic, and modern depth psychology. His execution in 1191 CE by order of Saladin, who feared the political implications of his teachings, only confirmed what his followers already knew. They were dealing with ideas powerful enough to transform not just individual consciousness, but entire civilizations. But what exactly was Suhrawardi attempting to accomplish? And how did he manage to preserve Persian mystical teachings within a religious culture that was officially committed to Arabic and Islamic sources? The answer lies in his genius for recognizing the universal principles underlying diverse wisdom traditions, and his courage in proclaiming that truth has no nationality, no historical boundaries, no religious monopoly. Suhrawardi's philosophical project began with a devastating critique of the Aristotelian rationalism that dominated Islamic philosophy in his era. Where philosophers like Averroes and Avicenna sought to understand reality through logical analysis of concepts, Suhrawardi insisted that direct spiritual experience must be the foundation of all genuine knowledge. This position aligned him with the Sufi mystics, but his approach went far beyond conventional mysticism into territory that was both more ancient and more revolutionary. The key to understanding Suhrawardi's achievement lies in his doctrine of knowledge by presence. The claim that consciousness can know reality directly without the mediation of concepts, arguments, or even sensory experience. This type of knowledge, which he called ishraq or illumination, represents the recovery of humanity's primordial capacity for direct spiritual perception. According to Suhrawardi, this capacity had been fully developed by the ancient Persian sages, partially preserved by Platonic philosophers, and completely lost by the Aristotelian rationalists who dominated medieval Islamic thought. Are we witnessing here a genuine recovery of ancient wisdom, or a brilliant philosophical innovation disguised as historical restoration? Suhrawardi's writings reveal detailed knowledge of Zoroastrian cosmology and terminology that he could only have acquired through contact with living Persian traditions. In his philosophy of illumination, he explicitly acknowledges his debt, writing, "There was among the ancient Persians a community of people, guided by God, who thus walked the true way, worthy sage philosophers. It is their precious philosophy of light that we have revived." This synthesis of Persian Gnosis with Islamic philosophy created something genuinely revolutionary, a mystical system capable of bridging different religious and cultural traditions. The practical implications of Suhrawardi's illuminationist philosophy become clear when we examine his understanding of the spiritual journey. Rather than following the conventional Sufi path of gradual purification and ascent through prescribed stages, the illuminationist practitioner learns to awaken the inner sun, the innate capacity for divine knowledge that exists within every human consciousness. This awakening occurs not through effort and discipline alone, but through what Suhrawardi calls Oriental philosophy, a direct turning towards the spiritual East from which all illumination originates. This spiritual East represents both a geographical reality, the Persian homeland where ancient wisdom traditions had been preserved, and a symbolic direction within consciousness itself. The illuminationist learns to orient attention toward the source of inner light, just as the Zoroastrian practitioner learns to face the sacred fire. This practice develops what Suhrawardi calls the eye of the heart, a spiritual faculty capable of perceiving the angelic realms that mediate between divine transcendence and human experience. How did Suhrawardi manage to preserve specifically Persian elements within his Islamic philosophical system? The answer reveals his remarkable skill as what we might call a spiritual diplomat. By identifying Persian Yazatas with Islamic angels, Zoroastrian light metaphysics with Quranic descriptions of divine illumination, and Persian mystical practices with techniques sanctioned by Orthodox Islamic mysticism, he created a synthesis that appeared thoroughly Islamic, while actually transmitting the essence of pre-Islamic Persian spirituality. The centerpiece of this diplomatic strategy was Suhrawardi's reinterpretation of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, Isra and Miraj, as an example of illuminationist experience. By showing that the Prophet's ascension through the seven heavens followed the same pattern described in ancient Persian texts about visionary journeys through angelic realms, Suhrawardi demonstrated that Islamic mysticism and Persian Gnosis were different expressions of the same universal spiritual reality. But perhaps Suhrawardi's most revolutionary insight concerned the nature of time and spiritual development. Where conventional mysticism taught that enlightenment requires years or lifetimes of gradual purification, Illuminationist philosophy claimed that direct knowledge of reality could occur instantaneously when consciousness learns to align itself with the spiritual principles that govern existence. This teaching directly echoed the Zoroastrian understanding of Zurvan. Time, as the realm within which eternity manifests itself through sudden illuminations and revelations. The techniques that Suhrawardi developed for triggering these illuminations combined Persian fire meditation with sophisticated philosophical analysis and visionary practices adapted from both Islamic and Platonic sources. The practitioner learns to concentrate attention on the inner light while simultaneously contemplating the logical relationships between different levels of reality. This dual focus eventually produces what Suhrawardi calls presential knowledge, direct awareness of spiritual truths that transcends the distinction between subject and object, knower and known. What happened to Suhrawardi's illuminationist philosophy after his execution? Rather than dying with its founder, it spread throughout the Islamic world, particularly in Persia, where it was recognized as the authentic revival of ancient wisdom. Subsequent Persian mystics like Mullah Sadra, Mir Damad, and the entire Isfahan school of Islamic philosophy built upon Suhrawardi's foundations, creating increasingly sophisticated syntheses of Persian Gnosis, Islamic mysticism, and philosophical analysis. The influence of Suhrawardi's work extended far beyond the Islamic world. When Renaissance scholars like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola began developing Christian Hermetic philosophy, many concepts that Suhrawardi had preserved later surfaced in their work through the complex transmission networks that connected Islamic and Christian intellectual worlds. The entire tradition of Western esotericism, from the Renaissance through modern times, bears traces of Persian wisdom that were kept alive through Suhrawardi's remarkable achievement. But the deepest mystery of Suhrawardi's legacy lies in his claim that the ancient Persian sages possessed knowledge that modern civilization has lost and desperately needs to recover. As we'll discover, this claim would inspire centuries of seekers to investigate the hidden wisdom traditions that connect ancient Persia with contemporary spiritual movements. In a Parisian library in 1928, a young French scholar named Henry Corbin opened a manuscript that would change the entire trajectory of Western understanding of mystical philosophy. The text was Suhrawardi's Philosophy of Illumination, and Corbin later wrote that through this encounter, his spiritual destiny was sealed. What Corbin discovered in that manuscript, and spent the next 50 years documenting, was evidence that Persian mystical philosophy had survived the Islamic conquest, the Mongol invasions, and centuries of cultural upheaval to remain a living tradition. This discovery would revolutionize not only Islamic studies, but psychology and spirituality in the contemporary world. More significantly, Corbin argued for the continuity of what he called Iranian Gnosis, a distinctive approach to spiritual development that had maintained its essential characteristics across vast spans of time and radical changes in political and religious contexts. But how exactly did Persian Gnosis manage to survive and influence traditions far removed from its original context? The answer reveals one of the most remarkable examples of cultural transmission in human history, a hidden river of wisdom that flowed underground for centuries, surfacing in unexpected places and times to nourish new forms of spiritual seeking. The first major conduit for this transmission was the Sufi tradition, particularly as it developed in Persia, under masters like Najm al-Din Kubra, Semnani, and the poets Hafez and Rumi. While these figures are usually studied as Islamic mystics, Corbin's research revealed that their understanding of light mysticism, angelic encounters, and visionary experience drew heavily on pre-Islamic Persian sources. The Sufi practice of colorful visions, the emphasis on the man of light as the goal of spiritual development, and the detailed mapping of subtle anatomy all reflect the influence of Zoroastrian mysticism. The second stream of transmission flowed through what Corbin called Iranian Islam, the distinctive form of Islamic philosophy that developed in Persia and maintained explicit connections to pre-Islamic wisdom traditions. Figures like Mullah Sadra, 1571 to 1636, created systematic philosophies that integrated Quranic revelation, Aristotelian logic, and what they openly acknowledged as ancient Persian Gnosis. This tradition remains alive today in the seminaries of Qom and Isfahan, where scholars continue to study texts that preserve insights originating in pre-Islamic Persia. Are we dealing here with continuous historical transmission, or with the independent rediscovery of universal principles? Corbin's research suggests both processes were at work simultaneously. Some specific practices, terminologies, and conceptual frameworks clearly represent direct transmission from Zoroastrian sources. But the most important insights appear to be rediscoveries of spiritual principles that emerge naturally when consciousness reaches certain levels of development, regardless of cultural or historical context. This understanding helps explain how Persian mystical concepts began appearing in medieval Jewish Kabbalah, Christian mysticism, and Islamic philosophy without direct historical contact between these traditions. The Kabbalistic teaching about the divine sparks hidden within material creation echoes the Zoroastrian understanding of Asha, cosmic truth, as the light that illuminates all existence from within. The Christian mystical tradition's emphasis on the inner Christ parallels the Persian doctrine of the Suhrawardi as the divine double of every soul. The Islamic concept of the perfect human being, al-insan al-kamil, directly reflects the Zoroastrian ideal of the Ashavan, the person who has achieved complete alignment with cosmic truth. But perhaps the most significant transmission occurred through the preservation of what Corbin called imaginal consciousness, the capacity to perceive the intermediate realm between pure spirit and material manifestation. This realm, which Persian mystics called the eighth climate and Islamic philosophers termed alam al-mithal, represents a form of reality that is more substantial than mental concepts, but more subtle than physical objects. Learning to navigate this imaginal realm was central to Persian mystical training, and its rediscovery by modern depth psychology represents one of the most important spiritual developments of our time. The influence of Persian Gnosis on Renaissance esotericism occurred primarily through the transmission of Greek Hermetic texts that had themselves been influenced by Persian teachings during the Hellenistic period, and through the complex networks of Islamic philosophy that reached Christian Europe through Spain and Italy. When Marsilio Ficino translated the Corpus Hermeticum in the 15th century, he was unknowingly introducing Western consciousness to concepts that originated in ancient Persia. The Hermetic understanding of humans as intermediary beings capable of ascending to divine consciousness directly parallels the Zoroastrian teaching about the soul's potential for union with Ahura Mazda. How did these ancient Persian insights begin influencing modern psychology and spirituality? The crucial breakthrough occurred when Carl Jung began developing his understanding of the collective unconscious and the process of individuation. Jung's concept of the self as the archetype of wholeness bears striking resemblances to the Persian understanding of the Suhrawardi. His emphasis on the integration of shadow material echoes Zurvanite teachings about the necessity of accepting both light and dark aspects of existence. His description of active imagination as a technique for accessing archetypal wisdom directly parallels Persian practices for entering the imaginal realm. Jung himself acknowledged the influence of Eastern wisdom traditions on his work, and his insights reveal striking parallels to Persian mystical psychology. When he wrote about the transcendent function that unites conscious and unconscious content, he was articulating in modern language what the Persian texts describe as the relationship between ordinary consciousness and the Suhrawardi. When he described individuation as the conscious realization of the self, he echoed the Persian teaching about becoming a living Suhrawardi, a person who has achieved conscious relationship with their divine archetype. But what does this mean for contemporary consciousness? If Persian Gnosis shaped medieval mysticism and modern psychology, how can we engage with its transformative potential today? Contemporary practitioners can engage with Persian wisdom by understanding the principles that underlie specific practices, rather than attempting to reproduce historical forms. The principle of fire meditation can be applied through candle flames, visualized light, or sustained attention to any luminous phenomenon that serves spiritual development. The principle of angelic relationship can be practiced through traditional Persian methods or through any approach that cultivates conscious contact with spiritual guidance while maintaining ethical discrimination. Standing in the fire temple at Yazd, watching flames that have burned continuously for over 1,500 years, we confront the ultimate question. What does this ancient wisdom offer to consciousness, evolving in conditions its founders never imagined? The persistence of these sacred flames through centuries of conquest and cultural transformation provides the perfect metaphor for how mystical insights transcend their historical origins. Just as these fires have been carefully tended and transferred across vast expanses of time, the essential insights of Persian mysticism have found ways to adapt to new contexts while preserving their transformative power. The Persian understanding of consciousness as inherently dualistic, capable of choosing between truth and deception, order and chaos, love and fear, offers sophisticated guidance for working with the polarities that characterize all spiritual development. Unlike traditions that seek to eliminate one pole in favor of another, Persian mysticism teaches the art of creative tension, holding opposing forces in dynamic balance while remaining oriented toward the highest possibilities. But how does ancient Persian wisdom address the contemporary crisis of meaning that affects individuals and cultures throughout the modern world? The Persian understanding of human beings as conscious participants in cosmic evolution provides a framework for discovering purpose that transcends both narcissistic self-absorption and nihilistic despair. Individual consciousness exists to serve the ongoing creation of greater beauty, truth, and compassion. But this service becomes possible only through developing authentic spiritual capacity. The Persian framework of good thoughts, good words, good deeds, humata, hukta, havarshta, provides comprehensive guidance for integrating spiritual development with ethical action. Good thoughts involve learning to perceive from the perspective of cosmic truth rather than personal preference. Good words involve speaking in ways that serve awakening rather than merely expressing opinions. Good deeds involve acting from understanding that individual and cosmic consciousness are ultimately one reality, manifesting through apparently separate forms. What makes this framework particularly relevant is its recognition that spiritual development and social responsibility are inseparable. The individual who seeks personal enlightenment while ignoring collective suffering demonstrates fundamental misunderstanding of how consciousness operates. The activist who seeks external change without developing inner wisdom typically creates more problems than solutions. Contemporary seekers can access this wisdom by approaching Persian mysticism as living spiritual technology rather than historical curiosity. The essential insights, the primacy of conscious choice, the reality of spiritual guidance, the possibility of transforming ordinary awareness into divine consciousness, emerge naturally from sincere practice, regardless of cultural context. The story we have traced reveals a profound truth about the nature of authentic spiritual wisdom. It transcends the historical conditions of its emergence to become a permanent resource for conscious evolution. The hidden light of Persia was never truly hidden. It burned openly in Zarathustra's Gathas, blazed through the elaborate cosmologies of the Hishin and Denkard, illuminated Suhrawardi's philosophical mysticism, and continues to shine in contemporary seekers who discover these principles through direct spiritual experience. What made it seem hidden was each historical period's tendency to assume that wisdom must be dressed in familiar cultural forms to be authentic. The genius of Persian mysticism lies in its recognition that consciousness itself bridges finite and infinite, temporal and eternal, individual and cosmic reality. This recognition appears throughout human history in different forms. But what makes the Persian contribution unique is its sophisticated understanding of the ethical dimension of spiritual development. Unlike traditions emphasizing either transcendence or engagement, Persian mysticism teaches serving cosmic evolution through full participation in human life. The fire that Zarathustra kindled nearly 3 millennia ago was not merely the founding light of a particular religion, but a manifestation of the divine intelligence that seeks to awaken human consciousness in every generation. That intelligence continues to work through those who choose alignment with truth, beauty, and goodness, rather than deception, ugliness, and selfishness. The ultimate teaching of Persian mysticism is that this divine intelligence is not separate from human consciousness, but represents its deepest nature and highest possibility. The journey from ordinary awareness to divine realization is not movement from one place to another, but discovery of what has always been present. In every moment of sincere spiritual aspiration, the same light that illuminated Zarathustra's visions continues to burn as the undying potential for consciousness to realize its divine destiny while serving the evolution of life itself. The fire burns on, waiting for those who have eyes to see, hearts to feel, and courage to serve the light that shines in darkness and can never be extinguished.